What if Abraham Lincoln didn't just carry a Bible, but challenged it, line by line, in the margins? Abraham Lincoln is remembered for his speeches, Gettysburg, Second Inaugural, all echoing with moral gravity. But few realize how much of that gravity was pulled straight from Scripture. Not always in reverence, sometimes in conflict, and sometimes in quiet, handwritten defiance. Lincoln didn't preach the Bible. He questioned it, annotated it. He read it not as a believer trying to prove a point, but as a man trying to survive history. And somewhere in the pages, between fire and mercy, wrath and forgiveness, he left fingerprints. Let's turn back the cover. We know Lincoln owned several Bibles. Some were gifted to him, others personal. The most famous, now held in the Library of Congress, was used during his first inauguration. But that one? It's pristine, untouched. The more interesting Bibles are the ones he didn't show the public, the ones found in his Springfield home, or described by friends and family. In one letter, a visitor to Lincoln's law office noted, his copy of the Holy Book was full of notes and markings, not pious exactly, more like reflective mutterings. That's Lincoln in a nutshell. He wasn't raised with religious certainty. Born in the Kentucky backwoods in 1809, Lincoln's early exposure to Christianity came through hellfire sermons and old-timey preachers who thumped their Bibles and shouted about damnation. But Lincoln didn't shout. He observed, he listened, then quietly tore things apart in his mind. There are also hints that Lincoln's fascination with the Bible was more literary than liturgical. In his younger years, he memorized vast sections of Shakespeare and Scripture alike, sometimes blending them in private debates and courtroom rhetoric. He saw in the Bible not just faith, but narrative, and more importantly, contradiction. He once told a colleague,
"I find in the Bible both a record of man's struggles and a shadow of his hopes."
It was this tension between law and grace, justice and mercy, that echoed most in his writings. He didn't quote Scripture to win arguments. He quoted it to remind people how fragile conviction can be. One of his favorite books of the Bible was Job, and that tracks. The story of a man tested beyond reason, stripped of everything, and left to sit in silence while his so-called friends offered terrible advice. That's political life. That's the Civil War. That's Lincoln's soul. He once wrote in the margin next to Job 38:2, which says, "Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge?" The single word,
Congress.
not subtle. Another of his go-to verses was Matthew 12:25. "Every kingdom divided against itself is brought to desolation." He quoted it in speeches, but in one Bible, a pocket-sized edition he kept in his office desk, the verse is underlined, and next to it, in pencil,
"This is not prophecy, this is a warning."
That may sound like splitting hairs, but it's everything. Lincoln didn't see the Bible as magic. He saw it as a mirror, a record of human behavior, divine tension, and unanswered questions. A text too powerful to ignore and too dangerous to accept blindly. During the Civil War, when death was measured in thousands per day, Lincoln would often retreat to his office with a candle, a law book, and the Bible. One soldier who served on the White House Guard recalled hearing Lincoln reading aloud one night, not a speech, but Psalm 90.
"The days of our years are 80 years and 10. And if by reason of strength they be 80 years, yet is their strength labor and sorrow."
The witness said Lincoln stopped, sighed, and whispered.
That sounds about right.
He was 54, already aging out of his own life expectancy. So what did Lincoln write in the margins? Not doctrine, not sermons. He wasn't trying to convert anyone. He was interrogating the text, wrestling it. In Leviticus, where it speaks of sacrifice and blood, one annotation reads,
"This is not justice, this is theater."
In Ecclesiastes, beside "to everything there is a season," he scribbled,
"But war seems to have no appointed time, only consequences."
And in Revelation, yes, he read Revelation. He bracketed a section describing fire and destruction and wrote,
"This feels like Charleston."
The man saw metaphor everywhere, but he didn't always buy it. He respected the Bible's weight, but he refused to be crushed by it. In 1862, after the bloody Battle of Antietam, Lincoln issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. It was a political move, a military strategy, and, in his mind, a moral necessity. But privately, he questioned it. In one of his journals, found later among his papers, he wrote this:
"If God wills this war to continue, so be it. But I hope he has read his own book again and remembered what he said about mercy."
It wasn't blasphemy, it was heartbreak. Lincoln was doing what prophets did, what poets did, what people who live too long in dark times must do. He argued with God, with the only tool he had, the margins. Even his law partner, William Herndon, a man who knew Lincoln well, noted that Lincoln's religion was a kind of deism, filtered through deep suffering and even deeper thinking. Herndon said Lincoln believed in God, but not in creeds. In private correspondence, Lincoln once said he believed truth was too large for one book. Yet he kept returning to that one book, the Bible, again and again, because it held the hardest questions, questions he knew America would have to face. He would often sit in the quiet of his study, staring at a page for hours, not in prayer, but in profound dialogue. Staff recalled he once muttered to himself after reading from Isaiah,
"A house divided. But what if the beams were never strong to begin with?"
It wasn't a quip, it was grief. His second inaugural address is considered one of the most theologically complex speeches in American history. It mentions God 14 times, quotes scripture 4 times, and yet Lincoln's theology was never nailed down. He said,
"The Almighty has his own purposes,"
which sounds definitive until you realize he never claimed to know what those purposes were. In the margins next to Isaiah 1:15, "When you spread forth your hands, I will hide mine eyes from you. Yea, when you make many prayers, I will not hear," Lincoln wrote.
Perhaps he already has.
That's not despair, that's honesty. There's a myth that Lincoln found religion in the White House, that the war baptized him. But the truth is messier. He was never a church member. He distrusted zealots. But he carried the Bible like a soldier carries a knife, not as a symbol, but as a necessity. He once said to a Union chaplain,
"I am not so much concerned that God is on our side as I am that we be on his."
And maybe that's the line that should be written in every margin. Despite all this, Lincoln's relationship with the Bible was deeply misunderstood in his own time and often still is. Many Americans wanted to cast him as a prophet or a saint, a man chosen by God to preserve the Union and free the enslaved. Sermons were preached in his name. Political cartoons depicted him in Christ-like poses. After his assassination, churches held vigils as though a religious martyr had fallen. But Lincoln himself resisted this sainthood. In life, he never joined a church. He rarely attended services. And when he did speak of the divine, it was with careful ambiguity. He believed in providence, yes, but it wasn't always comforting. It could be cruel, unpredictable, even silent. Still, his public use of scripture led many to assume he was a devout, Orthodox Christian. It made people feel safe to hear their president reference the Psalms or compare national division to ancient Israel. What they didn't see were the annotations, the hesitation, the theological footnotes scribbled in pencil. They didn't hear the man pacing alone, questioning whether God heard any of this at all. He once said to a friend,
"If I were to join a church, it would be one whose creed was this: to love God and love one's neighbor."
That's it. No altar, no incense, no absolutes. Just 2 lines. And even then, Lincoln would have asked, what does love look like when your nation is burning? He wasn't a prophet. He wasn't a preacher. He was a man holding a book he didn't fully trust and yet couldn't let go of. A book whose thunderous verses he neither obeyed nor dismissed, but engaged. Quietly, honestly. It's no wonder people misunderstood him. Lincoln gave them scripture without certainty, faith without formula. And in an era of loud conviction, that kind of humility was easy to misread. For all his silence on formal religion, Lincoln's writings left traces of something deeper, not doctrine, but a kind of sacred curiosity, one that extended beyond his own margins and into national myth. His private spiritual style frustrated both allies and enemies. Abolitionist ministers wanted him to invoke divine justice more openly. Southern critics accused him of using the Bible selectively to cloak political ambition. Meanwhile, newspapers speculated endlessly about his faith. trying to nail down the unknowable. Was he a closet Unitarian, a secret believer, or simply a moral man who found Scripture too complex for public consumption? Perhaps the most honest answer comes from Lincoln himself, scribbled beside a passage in Proverbs. "The heart of man deviseth his way, but the Lord directeth his steps." Next to it he wrote,
sometimes with a limp.
He didn't deny the divine, but he walked with a spiritual limp. A president who led the country through darkness without pretending to understand the light. Even in death, his image was dressed in Scripture. Funeral sermons compared him to Moses, leading a people to freedom but not living to enter the promised land. Hymns quoted Isaiah. Obituaries reprinted the Beatitudes. But none of them printed his marginalia. They didn't quote the question marks. They left out the limp. Lincoln's last known Bible, the one he was believed to be reading in the days before his assassination, contains no grand final note, no parting verse, no poetic underline, just a faded mark beside John 1:5. "And the light shineth in darkness, and the darkness comprehended it not." Make of that what you will, because that's what Lincoln would have done. He wasn't trying to interpret the Bible for others. He was trying to survive it himself, one page at a time, one mark at a time, one margin at a time. If stories like this move you, where power wrestles with principle and Scripture becomes a mirror, subscribe. Because the past isn't done speaking, and some of its loudest voices only wrote in pencil.